This is a great day for us, and spirits are certainly undaunted, even if the weather is challenging. And it's a great month for us. Today is certainly a highlight to have Richard Louv with us, one of the great speakers in the country, to talk about something very, very important later this afternoon. Last week, we had Jerry Ellis with us here as we celebrate Eco April, Earth Month, noted photographer. We also had the Virginia Geographic Bee last Friday here at Longwood. And as the month progresses, we'll have Peter Yarrow in 2 weeks, I think, and then there will be a reading of the Lorax at some point soon. There will be a rain barrel workshop later on in the month. There's a photo contest going on throughout the whole month that students, everyone in the Longwood community is participating in. And the LCVA, our museum, is running an exhibit called the 7 Habitats, done by some grade school kids. We will also be doing a groundbreaking ceremony for our new Environmental Education Center, which is a very special thing for us. We're going to do that later this week. And throughout the month, we're going to be having tours every Wednesday, I think, of the biomass facility, Longwood's biomass facility. For those of you who don't know, it is the oldest university biomass facility in the whole country, which means it's basically the oldest university biomass facility in the known galaxy. So we're very proud of that. And before I subside here, I would like to say a very big and hearty thank you to Sherry Swenson. Where are you, Sherry? And to Joe Boust as well. There have been many prime movers making this a special month for us, but you two have certainly taken the laboring oar, so thank you. And I ought to also say that Eco April, which evolved from Earth Day, supported by the Albert I. Beers Foundation, the American Democracy Project, and the Solstice program here in Longwood and Hull Springs are certainly very important to this month as well. So, thank you everyone. I will mount the podium again in about a half hour, but between now and then, let's enjoy some lunch. So, Joe Elton is Virginia's 6th State Parks Director. He served since 1994, working for 6 governors, both Democrats and Republicans. His time as the chief steward of our state parks has been eventful, absolutely. 6 new parks have opened, 5 more are in the planning and development stage. Today, he oversees 36 operating state parks. Those parks themselves include some 70,000 acres, more than 600 miles of trails, 1,800 campsites, and 260 overnight cabins and lodges. Each year, about 8.8 million visitors go to the state parks in Virginia, and about 1.1 million stay overnight. Our park system here really is truly one of the best, and Joe deserves much of the credit for that. 3 times during his tenure, Virginia's parks have been a finalist for the National Gold Medal in Excellence in Parks and Recreation Management. And meanwhile, Joe has served as president of several important organizations in the field, including the National Association of State Park Directors and America's State Parks Foundation. And last but not least, he is currently serving Governor Louv as interim director of the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Joe, please come up.
A much taller man was here before me. It is great to be with you all, and as Sherry especially knows, I don't miss an opportunity with any audience to share just a few thoughts about our park system, which quite literally is just out this door. And what I want to tell you is that having a park system that can collaborate and partner with the town of Farmville is pretty special. And Jerry Spates, on behalf of the town, has been one of our great partners and has helped us to build the trail in a way that makes the interface with the town and the university really special. It is great to be amongst so many from academia today, and I will tell you that I didn't know exactly where the conversation might go earlier this morning with the school children or during lunch today, but we have talked about all the problems in the world, and I think we have an idea on how we can solve many of them. I make the point often that people do not go to a state park to have a bad time. Okay? And if they do, it's shame on us as park stewards. And we have a number of park stewards throughout the room here today, senior leaders, kind of, where'd the president go? We found the easy chair. Kind of you to give me credit, but it's really teamwork. And one of the things we talked about at lunch today was the importance of volunteers in our organization. And we had a number of volunteers from the Central Piedmont Master Naturalist Program working alongside some of our park interpreters at the Fuqua School this morning. Last year, 340,000 volunteer hours. Thousands of volunteers, I could make up a number, but somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 individuals participated in our volunteer program. So I'm often asked, is that just a matter of necessity because the state doesn't give you enough money and the volunteers are needed for manpower? And the answer is yes, the state doesn't give us enough money, and we do need volunteers to help with projects, but in reality, our programs and our parks are enhanced when the citizens, the owners, are participating in a meaningful way, not just as visitors, but helping us deliver programs for the citizens. When we, and Sherry was on the front end of this, and former delegate Watkins Abbott, it wasn't a no-brainer in the minds of the House and the Senate that we ought to just go invest a bunch of money in High Bridge Trail and build this thing. We had to convince them, and we did Chmura Analytics in Richmond, one of the most highly regarded economic firms, did an analysis, and they said that within 5 years after this trail is completed, we will enjoy 65,000 visits a year. And that was enough to convince the General Assembly that this was a good idea. Last year it was 200, almost just shy of 200,000. In fact, Jerry, if you and I had gotten a busload of employees out there, we might have pushed it over 200,000. But just to show you how popular it is. So our mission since 1936 when we opened up our park system was to enhance the quality of life of our citizens by putting them in contact with nature. And in the 30s, the idea was that the working man and his family deserved to have access to these public lands. That was an idea from the 30s. I think maybe it's an idea that goes right back to our Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So I think we're standing right next to the American dream. I think we're living the American dream. But that's not why I'm here today, to brag about our parks. But indeed, I do agree we have a great system, and I hope you all visit it often and enjoy them. My job today is to introduce Richard Louv, who I first met. Well, let's put it this way. I read his book in 2004. At that time, it was like, have you read this book? If you haven't read this book, you don't belong in the industry. You can't be a parks director and not having read this book, because it's all about the importance of your business. And there's a prop somewhere. In 2007, Virginia hosted a national conference on parks. And the National Park Service Leadership Council and the National Association of State Park Directors came together in Colonial Williamsburg. And we used to do that all the time. And then over time, we didn't meet together as often. In fact, during the 20s and 30s, we met every year. But we hadn't done that a lot. And so we said in 2007, as we're brainstorming in Colonial Williamsburg, we need to leave here state and national parks committed to doing something valuable to the nation, something where we can collaborate together and make a bigger difference. And what we agreed to, and I have this huge thing somewhere, we may have left it at the People School. We agreed to a resolution that said we are going to work together to find ways to connect children to nature. And since 2007, there have been routine, regular phone calls, teleconferences, monthly, on that issue. How can we work together? And in Virginia, we started having meetings where state park managers and national park superintendents in the state would get together face to face like we are today and talk about how can we make this work better. Today, and Kristen Miller, who heads up our visitor experience program, is here somewhere. Where's she gone? Maybe she's not. She's working. Today, I would say that all of our natural and cultural and educational programs are influenced by Richard's work. I think of Richard Louv. All right, so this is a newsman, an author, a speaker. I think of his work as being pretty unique. He has launched a movement, a conservation movement in our nation, a human movement, interaction with nature, this movement in our nation, and he has no critics. Think about that. Rachel Carson, she's got plenty of critics. You name the author, you name the movement, it's got critics. But this movement, the Children of Nature movement, it just makes too much sense. Doesn't have the critics. Now, there have people have written, and I've got it in here, Richard, that they've reviewed your book, Children of Nature, the Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, and they said there's really nothing new in there. Nothing new in there that we hadn't seen before. Well, I would submit that what's new is how it was pieced together. And when we were in Roanoke and you spoke to I think it was the Outdoor Writers Conference some years ago, a question was asked, what were you thinking when you wrote this book that created this movement? And this gentleman said something like this: I'd written a number of books, and I had done a lot of research associated with each of these books, and I really felt like I had done my homework. And you know, not one of those books was commercially successful. And I thought I had one book left in me. And so I thought I would just take my life experiences, and I would just write what I felt like writing. That's how I heard it anyway. And what you end up with is really a best-selling book that launches a movement, that creates multiple organizations, that gets land managers and programmers in state, local, and national parks all thinking about how they can do this job better. And today I pushed away part of my cake. I pushed away part of my cake because it's all part of this. I'm fighting obesity too. And so I probably started saying this before I read Richard's book, but it's certainly true. And it's what the concept that our systems of parks all over the country were founded on. These are places where therapeutic tonic is found for the mind, body, and spirit. And so Richard Louv and Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, kind of pulled it all together and made it so obvious to us that we all have work to do in this regard. And if we do it well, the generation being born today doesn't have to be the first generation in history who won't outlive their parents. And if it's the American dream that I grew up with, that ought to be a goal for us. We ought to be the healthiest and the smartest country on the planet. And with that, I want to invite up Richard Louv, who is an inspiring writer and speaker who has, in my view, launched the most important movement of my generation. Richard.
Well, I can just sit back down. I mean, that was such a great introduction. I want to, thank the two Joes here, Joe Elton and Joe Boust, who is a good friend and one of the leaders nationally of the Children and Nature movement. He really has believed and is demonstrating with his Center for Excellence in Environmental Education here that this transcends silos. This issue transcends the departments of universities. It brings them together. It transcends politics. I have never seen an issue that brings people who don't usually want to be in the same room into the same room, like the disconnection between children and nature. Doesn't seem to matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They all want to tell me about the treehouse they had when they were kids. If they're old enough to have had that experience, and the younger you get, the less likely that is that they've had some kind of meaningful, transcendent experience in a special place in nature that's theirs. Okay? But I can tell you, conservatives, liberals, people across religious divides, they come together on this issue. Once they're in the same room, where you have conservationists, environmentalists sitting next to residential, commercial developers, sitting next to pediatricians, next to educators and conservatives, liberals, etc., they begin to talk about not only this issue, but other issues in a different way. They begin to talk about urban design in a way maybe they wouldn't have. It wouldn't even been on their agenda maybe. And I've seen that happen again and again. They talk about education differently. They talk about healthcare differently. There are now pediatricians that are now prescribing nature. In Portland, Oregon, the urban park district there, you may be doing something like this here that I'm not aware of, but I think you probably are, is now working with physicians who literally write prescriptions or recommendations to their families to go out and get in the parks. And the state and the urban park district calls the family when they get home and says, here's what we can do for you, come to the park. Well, the park rangers now acting as park health paraprofessionals, a role they really like, are helping these families get their green exercise, signing off on a prescription. It's going to go back, they're going to study it over time. My hunch is that they'll find good things. It is true that there's, and I agree with the so-called critics who say there's nothing new in the book. And I've written 2 books now about this issue. The second one is The Nature Principle, and that's more about a long-range view of society and about adults than it is about kids. It's kind of the next step. And I've always said there's nothing new. I mean, Frederick Law Olmsted knew all of this stuff, and he didn't have to wait for the research and the data to come in. When he created all those parks. People like Kathy McLaughlin with Project Learning Tree has been working on this issue, and there are others in here long before this particular book came along. There really isn't anything new here. What there is, though, is forgotten wisdom, forgotten knowledge. We went off the track. The last official stop of the official book tour for Last Child in the Woods, when it first came out in 2005, was in North Carolina, and the people there, the Audubon Society and some other groups, gave me a little coffee thing, celebration for the end of the book tour. And a guy came there. I heard he was coming and my jaw dropped. I quoted him often. His name is Thomas Berry. And he was a Catholic monk or priest. I can never get that straight because he was mostly an intellectual. And he wrote these wonderful books about the human relationship with nature. And I was told that he was coming that day. And I was also told that this was the first time in 3 years that he'd been away from his assisted living area, place that he lived, since he'd had a stroke. But he was determined to come to that coffee, and he arrived, and he's revered in North Carolina and many places. Time magazine called him at one point the leading eco-theologian in the world. And the Red Sea parted as he walked through this group toward me. And I've often said, in fact, in his obituary in the New York Times, I was quoted as saying there's two beatific people that I've met. One is Mr. Rogers, and the other one was Thomas Berry. And he looks like Mr. Rogers, kind of. And he comes through, and he grabs my hands, and he says, I've been waiting 10 years for someone to write this book. And I was moved. I mean, this guy's a hero. And I got to know him. Every time I go back to North Carolina, I'd go take him to his favorite restaurant. We'd have lunch. And I would listen. We didn't talk, I listened. And I wanted to listen. I mean, he was such a beautiful... Kathy, did you ever meet Thomas Berry? I know.
I've not met him.
Oh, it's just he was so fine. But he said the basis of his thinking in his book, and one of the best is called The New Work, the Great Work, is that for human history and prehistory, particularly history, human beings looked essentially to two places for their sense of meaning. One was their religious text, and the other is to the universe itself, to nature. And he said, at 91, by the way, when I got to know him, he'd lived through most of the 20th century. He did not want to talk about the 20th century. At 91, all he wanted to talk about was the 21st century. The reason he didn't want to talk about the 20th century, he said, we lost our way. We lost one of the two major sources of our meaning, nature. And he said that the great work of the 21st century is to bring those back into balance and to create a new relationship with the natural world. And I think that really is the basis of what both of you have talked about, Joe, the two Joes, to what you and I were talking about here, about how we perceive the future. That underlies almost everything that we face that is a crucial challenge. I won't talk very much longer because I know I'm supposed to hold this for later. But one of the things I'm going to talk about later is what we were talking about at lunch. And I've been thinking about this more and more, which is how we talk to our kids and ourselves about the future. We have to be very careful how we talk to our kids and ourselves about the future. I've come to the conclusion that most Americans, if you ask them to conjure up images of the far future, the images that will pop up immediately are ones that look a lot like Mad Max and Blade Runner, and at best, the Hunger Games. At least there's a few trees. It's a post-apocalyptic future. The number one selling fiction genre for young adults now is called dystopic fiction. It's about a future in which not even vampires have a good time. And I'll talk more about this later, but I was sitting with some students at DePaul University who took me to lunch. These were environmental studies students. And they were despondent. And one young woman said, she's a very hip young woman, I know that because she had tattoos. And she said, I'm 20 years old, and all my life I've been told it's too late. I'm 20 years old, and all my life I've been told it's too late. Oh my God, she's right. We've heard other messages, but the message from my profession, news media, profession in many ways from the entertainment media, message from environmentalism, and I consider myself an environmentalist, is it's too late. Keep thinking, what's it like to be a 14-year-old today growing up surrounded by adults who kind of shrug and say, no, we tried to make things better in the 60s. It's too late. The civil rights movement never stopped talking about the bad news. I'm not talking about good news for good news' sake. They never stopped talking about the injustice, about lynchings, about terror. But that wasn't the only set of images that they talked about, that we talked about as a society then. There was this other set of images. Martin Luther King's speech, as others have said, was not called I Have a Nightmare. You could see that future. And he said, I might not get to the mountain with you, but I've been to the mountain. I might not get there with you, but I've been to the mountain. I've seen that future. And here's how it looks. People, we could see it in our mind's eye. It's still haven't gotten there, a little closer. Because we know where we're going. Because we have images ahead. There are target for our ambitions and our need to have meaning in our lives. It's still there. Except that, as an overall society, even that has faded. And as an overall society, we don't have a countervailing set of images to that dystopic, post-apocalyptic future that we carry around in our minds. The problem isn't the presence of dystopic literature. 1984 was a good morning. I'm not saying that's a problem. The problem is no set of images over here that we carry around that says, this is where we could go, this is how it could be. I think nature is at the center of those images, is kind of the sun of a set of planet images, in a sense, that we could begin to form and go there. I keep thinking of that young woman who said, it's all my life I've been told it's too late. I think our great work, in addition to reconnecting with nature, is to start creating those images, to have the courage to be idealistic again. It's been a long time. So I'll stop there, and I think we'll have a discussion. I'll talk about that later. Thank you.
Let me throw out the first question and preface it with Frederick Louv that was mentioned. His contributions to American society are just amazing. But he's a man who fought depression most of his life. Stephen Mather, the founder of the National Park Service, his contributions are enormous, and yet had to be institutionalized for sometimes long periods of time, hidden from the public during the course of his career, had to be restored. John Muir. I remember reading a letter that Muir had written to his wife. He had been late in life hiking in North Carolina, and it went something like this. I didn't think I had it in me, but you're absolutely right, darling. Coming east and hiking in the mountains did restore my health, and I feel much better. So we have in Virginia a unique, tragic circumstance where a state senator's son snaps, and now there's a focus on mental health. So my question to Richard is, how do we use the bad to launch into the kind of discussion that we need to have to create that brighter future, and how do we impact those second, third, fourth, and fifth graders that we saw this morning?
Well, that's interesting, because this morning at the school, the kids, I asked them to do two things. So you got two assignments. One is to, this week, go outside and see how many of your senses discover your senses that you don't usually use. And actually, the scientists who look at the human senses no longer talk about 5, they talk about as many as, conservatively 10, and as many as 30, most of which we don't use. And most of which, increasingly, when we sit in front of that screen, we're trying to block out. So we're setting up an environment in our schools and at home for our kids in which we're asking them to sit still in front of that screen. We're doing it maybe not directly, but by example often. And block out your senses. Just use the couple that you need to go anywhere allegedly in the world, in the internet. That, to me, I said this to the kids, is the very definition of being less alive. To being blocking out your senses. What parent wants their kid to be less alive? What teacher wants their students to be? Well, maybe some teachers want their students. Yeah, truly, who among us wants to be less alive? A few people do. And that's really what it comes down to. The second thing I ask these kids to do is this week, take your parents outside and tell them if they're not going to go outside, they get grounded. The mental health issue permeates all this, and one of the things I say to the kids is the benefits of this. You know, your parents will feel the same things that you do when you go outside. Maybe sometimes you're kind of down. You know, you go outside, I'll tell you, you're probably going to feel better. There's actually more research is backing up on mental health, the benefits of that, than there is on physical health in terms of the natural world. That mental health issue cannot be overestimated. And one of the reasons for the last child, I tell this story actually in the Nature Principle. So when I was growing up, I associated health, I wrote this as a kind of confession, you know, of my own bias. I associated nature, being outside with my family, with health. And mental health in particular. My parents were great parents. They gave me the gift of nature. We did a lot of fishing. You should have heard my mother's language when she missed a good bass. It was great. But we had a garden in the backyard on the edge of suburbia. And my father and I, we would be out there and I'd be taking out the dog bones and the rocks in front of him as he tilled the land. And I would look at the back of his neck and see the tan and the creases and the dirt and the creases where he was working. I love being out there with him. And so I associated nature with the best times of my family. Over the years, my father became mentally ill and more ill, and became an alcoholic. His dream was to retire in his late 40s and move to Table Rock Lake, or one of the lakes in the Ozarks, and fish all day. Build a little house, fish all day. They got more and more affluent, my family did, and more disengaged. I didn't, but my father and mother did from nature. And he got sicker and sicker. And by the time they did get to that little house in the Ozarks on the lake, he never left the kitchen table. And he did not have a good end. So I used to pray, actually, that my father would not be a chemical engineer anymore, but that he would be a forest ranger. He would be a park ranger, because I knew it made him happy. Now, I wrote that as a confession, you see, that I have a bias. I don't cherry pick the research, because there's no research that disproves this that I've seen. But there's a lot of research, almost all of it is correlative, not causal, because we weren't asking the question 30 years ago. But that research keeps building. I mean, since Last Child, even since Nature Principle came out, there's a lot of research coming in, and it's all pointing in the same direction. It's very rare that you get correlated research in mass pointing generally in the same direction. So that's a long answer. I sometimes say that the length of my speech is the length of my answers is in direct proportion to my jet lag, and it's not too long ago I came back from Australia. So.
Hang on, I'm not going too far here. Questions for Richard? Comments?
Since your last child in the woods, and I agree that you probably have no critics except the pharmaceutical companies, and I commend you if you can create those as critics. But how would you address not the critic, but the competition with social media for children, as well as the affluenza of providing all of this technology instead of the engagement with nature? Because for the first time in human history, after nature deficit disorder, DSM-5 now has the first disorder related to human machine, internet deficit disorder. So these are very, the movement, you have a lot of competition, not with those in this room necessarily, but with schools, with universities, with corporations, with the ability to navigate the marketplace going forward.
The President and I were just talking about, you had a phrase for it, medicated student body, the medicalized student body, that about 30% of the students here are on some form of mainly stimulants like Ritalin and et cetera, or antidepressants, 30%. And I've heard that 30% of boys in many schools are on Ritalin or have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. I won't get off into that, and I'm not a radical on Ritalin, but how can it be? And just the other day, autism spectrum has been, it has been defined so widely, so broadly, that I bet 5, 6, 10 of us in this room would be on the autism spectrum if we really looked at it. Don't look at it. And, what is that saying about a medicalized society? What is that saying? And the President and I were talking about the good news is that some of those disorders have been, it's a good thing that people can step forward and talk about them and seek help and all that. But the strange thing is that you're stigmatizing all kinds of kids in order to destigmatize those problems. I talked just at the school, I talked to a young woman whose daughter had been diagnosed as attention deficit disorder. It was devastating to her daughter. Began to think of herself that way, and finally they got her off drugs. They said it had sad effects. It wasn't doing a good job with her. Some kids it does. They changed their diet and they got their kid outside a lot. And now the kid is an A and B student and no longer thinks in terms of that brand that she as a kid is branded. So part of the, critics is the wrong word. What I am the cheerleader of is the kind of work that Kathy and many of you and Joe and many of you have been doing for a long time, which are counter trends to the massive trends of medication as the solving of everything, including rowdy kids in school. I would have been put on Ritalin, and nature was my Ritalin. And again, some kids need it. I don't want to stigmatize the ones that do. Some kids need some kind of medication, but what proportion of those 30% of the boys? Might that have something to do with the fact we so radically changed childhood? But another force, the counter forces, the good work that many of you are doing is up against, is bigger than we even know. Some of us breathed a sigh of relief, and it looked like no child left behind was going to get left behind. Now that was done with the best of intentions. Didn't work for everybody. Now, I don't think we should breathe a sigh of relief too soon, because if you look at what's coming down the pike, with hardly any public debate, it's going to make us possibly miss No Child Left Behind. I'm an agnostic on core standards. That's not the issue. The issue is how they will be executed. The people who are in charge of that debate right now have an economic horse in that race. It's the technology companies. It's the educational software companies. computer companies, etc. They know exactly what kind of school they want. And again, it's with good intentions. Also has to do with sales of their products. Their school, kids will be totally immersed in electronics. They're not talking about taking kids outdoors. They're not talking about reinstituting recess, which has been cut in district after district. They want their kids in the classroom, maybe out beyond the classroom, but always under an electronic harness. More and more video games in the classroom. That's the plan. More and more video games as teaching tools in the classroom. The good news is that testing as we know it will disappear. The bad news, at least to me, is that we won't need it because the machines will be watching these kids all the time. The people who are proposing this as the future of education speak with no sense of shame and hardly any irony about what they literally call stealth monitoring. The machines, some of the same technology that watches the produce in grocery stores. That's what's coming down the line. Primarily, again, not because it's bad or evil. Technology is great. I'm an early adapter, at least used to be. You know, I've got an iPhone, I got an iPad, I like them. That's not the point. Technology is great in schools in some ways. What's not so great is when it becomes the only way. And when we lose that sense of balance, when we lose actually part of our humanity in the process. There's no countervailing force to that. There's no economic force right now that stands up directly to that gives some balance. I think the Children of Nature movement is the core of a potential grassroots effort to make sure our schools still place the humanity of our children at the top of the list of priorities. And that, so far, is the only countervailing force that I've seen. Another long answer.
Any other questions for Richard?
Rich, how can we encourage teachers to be teachers in the field to have a sense of comfort in introducing kids to the school ground and to nature?
Many teachers, particularly younger ones, are afraid of nature because many of them belong to essentially the first denatured generation. Project Learning Tree and other efforts have for years been helping teachers. Your work for years has been helping teachers learn how to do it. And, the more you know how to do something, the less you fear it. I think we need to get more deeply ingrained in the education schools themselves before teachers enter the classroom. That's one of the primary targets, I think. I've learned that classroom teachers often look to the student teacher that's coming in for the new trends. And so what if one of those new trends was to connect kids to nature for a lot of good reasons, having to do with cognition, ability to think clearly, ability to create, all of those, physical health, mental health. If we could do that, that would go a long way. The other thing is to talk about the teachers themselves and what this does for them. There's a Canadian study that shows that teachers who get their kids outdoors are far less likely to burn out, certainly as soon as teachers who don't get that opportunity. So I think that's, and finally, I think something the Children of Nature Network has done, as you know. The Children of Nature Network, childrenandnature.org, is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child. Encourages what we call natural teachers. And I proposed this idea because I realized that teachers were coming up to me after my sermonettes, and there were always 2 or 3, and they would say, I'm getting my kids outdoors, and I don't care what the administration says. Sometimes it was the environmental education teacher, but often it was the art teacher, the math teacher, not so much the math teacher, but often it was the art teacher or the English teacher or the biology teacher who actually believed that the kids had to get their hands wet and their feet muddy to know something about biology. And they were almost doing it in a subversive way. My brother, as a high school teacher, has a fishing club. He's one of those natural teachers. And they cross the disciplines. You know, it's not just environmental education, it includes that, but it goes beyond that. And so one of their characteristics, these teachers, that I at least detected, was that they all felt alone. I wonder, what if they didn't feel alone? What if there was a sense of identity? Let's give them a self-flattering name, natural teachers. I'm a natural teacher. And a respectful name. And then set up a way for them to talk to other natural teachers and be networked, not only in their own community, but around the world, and know that they're not alone. Yeah. And we've been working on that, and it's nowhere near what it could be or should be, but I think that's another way, is to encourage those teachers, honor those teachers. They don't get honored very much. We had a national award, and I hope if we can get the funding, we can keep doing it. Lindblad expeditions, those great ships that take people to the Arctic and Galapagos and all that. Sven Lindblad read Last Child, tracked me down. We had a National Natural Teachers Award, and that teacher got to go on a free trip to the Galapagos, courtesy of Sven Lindblad. The whole purpose of that is to honor those teachers, to really say, you are doing good work, even if your administration doesn't think so.
Mr. Louv, we've been struggling with for a long time evaluating our progress. And how do you know you've made any difference? Can you talk a little bit about metrics in terms of children and nature and families?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think anybody who works in this field knows that's a really tough question to answer. For one reason, this is one of the most understudied and yet most important issues that we have. Only fairly recently, that people like Tamara Willett, next to you, is a natural teacher. She actually came up. No, I came up with that phrase, but I suggested that for your book. But Tamara's writing that I'm honored about to and saying finish it. How do you measure that? There are some measurements that people have, but this is a fairly new realm in terms of measuring that. And measuring against what? We don't have baseline figures from 15 years ago. I don't think we do we? And so that gets pretty tough. I think that there are other ways of measuring progress other than how many kids you're getting outdoors, as compared to what? I don't know. There are measures of progress, for instance, the rising number of nature preschools. The number of pediatricians that are now prescribing nature, the number of natural teachers. Unfortunately, remember, these are counter trends, because even as the natural teachers in natural preschool, nature preschools increase in number, you've got this major trend of electronics in the schools and all that it's up against. So you always have to think of these terms as the progress of counter measures. Then you can look internationally, and I've been talking for a while about, as have others, but I wrote about this in the Nature Principle and said, we got to think of this as a human right. That until we think about this connection of children to nature, and all of us to nature, in a positive way, as a human right, it will not be taken seriously. It'll be a nice to have, not a have to have. And in fact, if we're going to have a sense of responsibility to the environment, that doesn't come without a sense of right to nature. But the two go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, ultimately. So I've been saying this for a while. And in November, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a group of thousands of conservation groups from all over the world, passed a resolution, said this is a human right. And they talked about nature deficit disorder and prelude to this, but this is a human right. That's measure of progress. Now, ultimately, I think those measures are more important than, let me say that I quote a lot of studies And the more studies that are out there, the better. But in the nature principle, I said in the beginning, I want to make clear, I don't base this argument only on science. Science is tricky. Last week, coffee was bad for us. Now it's good for us, right? Science is tricky. And because science has ignored this, and I have theories about why they've ignored it. One of them is where the research money comes from, but I won't go there. So that's tricky. And again, to go back to the civil rights movement, you know, if they'd been waiting for all the data to come in, think how many people would still be waiting. Some things are done because they are morally right. We know that this is morally right, that future generations should not be denied a connection to the natural world, which is part of their humanity, part of our humanity. Anything that is fundamental to our humanity, in a positive sense, we have a right to. And that's why we need to begin to think about this as a moral question, not just a scientific question.
One last question?
Thank you, Richard. I'm always thrilled to hear you speak, and I always hear new things, so it's wonderful. But you touched on this. One of the great benefits of your movement is that it touches on parents and families. And we do know that kids spend a lot of time in schools, and that's, you know, it's like, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So we work in schools because that's where the kids are. But I really love the idea of families connecting with nature. And we're trying to work on early childhood. So you've got your wonderful movement with the nature centers and that. And I just wondered if you wanted to just speak for a moment on the importance of the early childhood centers. And that's the place where parents who, like me, had to work and put our children in centers, you know, to learn. If we could push they can't all be wonderful nature early childhood centers, but they all include that. And so how can we take that movement and really move into that early childhood world and have that be a critical component of every child, not just every nature center school, but every child's early learnings using the outdoors.
But not just what?
Well, not just formal schools, you know, that's important. Thank you for recognizing that. I know, but what I love about your movement too is it includes parents and families, right? And so how do we take advantage of parents and young children in that movement in the early childhood centers and really push that forward?
Well, first, Kathy, as you know, it's our movement, and you precede me, you know. Not my movement, you said your movement. Right?
Well, I think you really raised the visibility.
Yeah, you've been on this case longer than I have, so I'm doing great work. I think that there's a couple answers, many answers to that. One of those answers is to somehow convince parents that nature is an enrichment. It's not just Suzuki violin, you know, it's an enrichment. But if you want your kid to get into Harvard, tell your kid to go outside. Somehow to begin to convince parents that this is going to make their kids smarter.
Longwood, actually.
Pardon me?
Longwood.
That's part of it. But you have to have mechanisms to do that. This isn't a PR campaign. You know, you can put out those messages all you want, but unless you have literal mechanisms to make it happen. One of those mechanisms, I believe, as you know, is the Family Nature Club. And the Troll Nature Network has been promoting this. Again, this is not a new idea, but we've been promoting it a lot, which is multiple families joining together to go outside. That's simple. For us, at least, it started a few years ago in Roanoke, Virginia. A young father and preschool teacher emailed me and said that he and his wife had been inspired by Last Child and other things. They started getting the whole family out to the park on Saturdays, going on hikes. One day the 5-year-old says, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" So they started inviting other families. Today they have over 800 families on our mailing list. The Family Nature Club, they call it Family Nature Club, and it's, you know, it's play dates, nature play dates, family nature play dates. You call up and you arrange for 2, 3, 5 10 families to show up someplace and do gardening or to go on a hike or something. There's perceived safety in numbers because the fear of strangers, the fear that is out there, even of nature itself, is so palpable. So we have to face that fear and not denigrate parents who feel it. I felt it even though I knew better. I knew better because I knew that the statistics show that violent crime toward children outside the home had been going down at least 30 years. And yet I still felt that because we're being conditioned every day to live in that state of fear. So I don't judge the parents' view. This isn't just about nostalgia. We have to come up with new mechanisms. So these family nature clubs deal with that fear issue. There's now at least the ones that have registered with the Children Nature Network. I think the last time I looked, about 200 of them. And many of them have hundreds of families as members. In San Diego, one started, I think, 2.5 years ago. It has over 1,000 families as members. And that, if we had 50 other ideas, and if we had like that, and if we had 5,000 family nature clubs in the next 5 years, with hundreds of families each, at that point you're talking about self-replicating cultural change. All you have to do is download a free toolkit and start your own. You don't have to get the professional blessing from anybody. You don't even have to get a foundation grant. Just do it. And people are just doing it. So those kinds of approaches, I think, are very important. One of the benefits of that is that it works in any kind of economic group, any kind. It can work in inner cities. It can work in suburbia, et cetera. Any kind of geography. And it not only creates an opportunity for kids to connect to nature, it creates social capital. The parents who meet, the families who meet become friends. That helps mental health right there. And it creates, if that were combined with a lot of similar self-replicating social change tools, that creates a new constituency for environmental education. And for the kind of good work that you're doing and Joe and others are doing, a new constituency for parks and so forth. I was asked to give the keynote speech at the first White House Summit on environmental education. And 2 days before I was supposed to be there, I found out that I had been asked to do that right after the administration cut $35 million from the federal budget for environmental education. So I said, oh, no. I've been set up as the apologist. So fortunately, they shifted me to the last keynote, to the wrap-up keynote, and they sacrificed the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Education at the beginning, and he actually deserved it more than the Secretary of Interior, and at the beginning. But I don't know if you remember this, but I said, so it's time to think. I said, I woke up this morning, facing 150 at least environmental education leaders who are really ticked off. And I said, I woke up this morning thinking about the movie Jaws. And I know that's environmentally correct, but I just like that movie a lot. And so I thought of the movie Jaws. Remember that part in the movie where one of the guys on the boat, they finally realized just how big a shark they're dealing with there. One of the guys says, we need a bigger boat. I said, that's fine, we need a bigger boat. We need a boat that is beyond environmental education if there's going to be a future for environmental education. We need a boat of family nature clubs. We need to build essentially a new political and social constituency. I hesitate to use the word political. But it is a new constituency. We have to build that in order for, to stand up against the overuse of technology in schools. We need it to support your work and your work. And that constituency has to be built at the university level by going, as you are, Joe, by going across, outside of the silos of education and bringing people together into the same room. And this issue, as I said, will do that.
Richard, thank you so much